Did you know there's a unique way of buying property without qualifying for financing? Let's talk about agreements for sale and how they are different from a standard agreement of purchase and sale. Agreements for sale have been used widely in the US and also in Alberta. I'm not sure about other provinces, but I know that they're very popular in Alberta. They were brought into popularity by a friend of mine, another lawyer out there. His name is Barry McGuire, and he is who I learned all about agreements for sale from. Stick around if you want to hear about this brilliant investment tactic. In an agreement for sale, the buyer buys the property from the seller, but the seller remains on title, and the buyer assumes the mortgage of the seller. The direct benefit is that buyer then doesn't have to qualify for financing and may have more advantageous terms on the mortgage if the seller's mortgage terms are better than the terms that would be offered today to the buyer. So if a buyer finds a property that the seller is looking to sell and it has a mortgage that's really advantageous on the property, then the property can be bought by the purchaser, stay in the name of the seller, who becomes the trustee of the buyer. So for example, if a buyer finds a property as $1 million purchase price and there's a $600,000 mortgage on the property for, say, at 2% interest, the buyer would be really interested in maintaining that mortgage for the duration of the term. And it also gives an opportunity during that time to the buyer to uplift the value of the property without having to obtain his own mortgage. Typically for the balance, the other $400,000 will often have a combination of a down payment and a vendor take back. One of the main benefits of this strategy, it's difficult to find properties that cash flow a lot of the time. Sometimes if the seller has a mortgage with more advantageous terms, the buyer can purchase the property and make it cash flow for the duration of the uplift in value. And also, financing's not simple, right? So for a buyer, it's really advantageous to not have to qualify for financing. The closing can happen faster. The buyer will only need to get financing at the end of the term of the agreement for sale, and at that time get financing on a property that is presumably uplifted in value. And for the seller, the beauty of an agreement for sale is that they can obtain a higher sale price because the property can cash flow at a higher price. A lot of investors have a hard time finding properties that cash flow. And on top of that, a lot of investors struggle with how complex it is to be approved for financing. Especially at the beginning of an investor's journey, it's difficult to obtain financing. We keep feeling like we're tapped out while we increase the portfolio. And so an agreement for sale is such a great solution to acquire more properties and grow a portfolio without having to depend on financing. And for the seller, in a situation where you're looking at selling a property, but you're struggling to find buyers because the buyer obtaining traditional financing means that that property won't cash flow, by offering this option to the buyer, there's an opportunity for the seller to sell for a higher sale price. Investors keep hearing all of these buzzwords like vendor takebacks and bare trust agreements and agreements for sale. And these concepts are not simple to understand, and information isn't always readily available out there. Or on the flip side, there's overwhelm of information and it's really difficult to find out what is truth and what is accurate. So let's break down agreements for sale and what that means so that you can seize more investment opportunities. A creative investor will be able to make a deal happen and see the possibility of a deal happening where others don't. So having knowledge of these tools is so powerful because it allows investors to have a leg up and the only one in the race. Because a lot of the time what ends up happening when there's a good deal out there that everybody knows it's a good deal, it's a bidding war. And the end result is it's not that great of a deal for the end buyer. But if a real estate investor uses their creativity and has knowledge of these tools, they're able to see the possibility with a property that most investors will overlook. So in the US, they use different tools like this. One of the strategies is called buying subject to. So if I'm buying a property from a seller, I can buy the property subject to the mortgage. In Ontario, most mortgages have a due on sale clause. What does that mean? That means that if the property gets sold, the mortgage has to be paid on closing of the sale. And so buying a property and transferring title to the buyer while keeping the existing mortgage, when it gets sold, the mortgage has to be paid on closing of the sale. Doable. When you reach the large multifamily, sometimes the mortgage will be assumable, especially if it's a CMHC mortgage. But generally speaking, it's tough to buy a property subject to the mortgage and assume the mortgage that's on title. And so the agreement for sale strategy allows a buyer to do that because the seller remains on title to the property. There's only a handful of lawyers in Ontario that know how to do agreements for sale. But what we did is we took it one step further. We actually took the templates that are currently being used, which were out of Alberta, from my good friend Barry. He did a great job with those, but they're not cookie cutter usable in Ontario in a way that's smooth. And so what we did is completely redrafted it and put the clause directly in the schedule of the agreement of purchase and sale. And it makes it even more palatable for a seller and therefore easier to process a transaction with the same concepts, but in a document that's just a little easier to operate with. It probably stemmed from a lawyer understanding it and being passionate about bringing it to his area. And then he was actually so passionate that he started training people in Ontario. I got trained by Barry McGuire here in Ontario. This is why agreements for sale are so popular in Alberta and not yet in Ontario. It's just lack of knowledge, and the information hasn't been dispersed in Ontario the way it has in Alberta. And there aren't that many lawyers, there's only a handful of lawyers in Ontario that do agreements for sale, and we require two sides of the transaction to be with lawyers who understand the structure. In fact, every single transaction that I have had where the lawyer on the other side was not a lawyer very intimately familiar with agreements for sale has failed. It is still really difficult to get an agreement for sale completed because of the lawyers, and sometimes convincing a seller to use a lawyer that is not their lawyer so that the lawyer will have that information is a little bit difficult. So we try to make sure to spread that information as much as possible to really bring awareness and knowledge about the strategy in Ontario. So if you want to capture those elusive deals that others are not seeing, you need to learn this strategy. Let's have a chat. An agreement for sale is all in the contract. It's contract based because the deed doesn't change hands at the time of purchase. So an agreement for sale sets out that during the period of the duration of the agreement for sale, the starting point is what we call the possession, and the end point is what we call the closing date or the completion date. From the possession date to the completion date, the buyer is already the owner, and the seller holds the property in trust for the buyer. So from the possession date to the completion date, because the property is still in the name of the seller, there needs to be an arrangement between the buyer and the seller as to how the transactions are going to go on a daily basis. Most of the time, the way that that's done is that they will open a joint bank account where the seller has the right to view and the purchaser has the right to control. So at least the seller can see that the money's coming in and going out and paying the bills that are still in the name of the seller. The buyer will have control so that the buyer can put the money in and make sure to pay all the bills that need to get paid. That way, both parties can see that both sides are doing what they need to do on a daily basis during that transition. Now, there are a lot of moving pieces that we need to look at to make sure that both parties are protected. Things like insurance, because if the insurance is in the name of the seller, what happens if there's a loss? We need to account for that and make sure that there are provisions to protect the buyer in that instance. We also look at things like what happens if the seller dies? What happens if the seller gets incapacitated? What happens if the seller's a corporation and the buyer wants to do renovations, right? Because the buyer is not on title to the property. How do we make sure that the buyer maintains control of the property that they own from the beginning during that period of time? So there's all kinds of things like that that we need to look at, and the contract will establish all of these clauses to ensure that both sides are protected. Here's a success story by one of my clients using an agreement for sale strategically. So I have a client who wanted to buy a piece of vacant land. Land had a mortgage on it in the name of the seller, and we wanted to maintain that mortgage for the approximately 6 months that it would take for the buyer to get site plan approval and get building. And so during that period of time, instead of transferring the deed to the buyer, buyer, what we did is we did an agreement for sale whereby the buyer became the owner, had full control of the property, but the seller remained on title as the buyer's trustee and therefore maintaining that mortgage during that period of time. Once they obtained site plan approval and were able to get construction financing, the deed was transferred to the buyer and then they were able to take their project to the next level. Here's a great example of how we used an agreement for sale to reach a successful conclusion. Two friends were living together. The house was owned by one of the friends. The owner of the house wanted the seller, wanted to move out, but wanted his friend to buy the house. The problem was that his friend couldn't qualify for a mortgage just yet. So what we did in that scenario is we used an agreement for sale so that the buyer could take over the mortgage of the seller for a period, I believe, of 1 year. It allowed the buyer to grow his credit and to make sure that he could qualify for the mortgage after the 1 year. And that allowed then the seller to move out and get his down payment and get started on what he wanted to do next. He didn't need to clear his credit of the house for that period of 1 year. That's why this was such a great strategy. It allowed the buyer to become full on the owner of the property and start operating the property in this house as his own home, have full control and possession of the home, and build his credit, build the value of the house so that when the time came a year later, was easily able to obtain a mortgage and complete the agreement for sale and get the deed in his name. Here's another way that clients have used agreements for sale in a strategic way. A client wanted to buy a multifamily building at a price that, unfortunately, even though the building was quite nice, the rents were quite low and the building needed some work. And so the buyer said to the seller, I'm willing to buy this building, but your sale price is too high. I can't, if I get a mortgage, and this was about a year or two ago when the interest rates were a lot higher. And so the buyer said, if I get a mortgage, I'm gonna get a mortgage at 6-7%, I cannot cash flow this property and I need to uplift the value by slowly raising the rents and by doing some renovations. I can obtain a mortgage at a decent rate and have the property cash flow. So what we did is we used an agreement for sale whereby the buyer became the owner. The seller was able to sell the property at a purchase price or a sale price that made sense to the seller. The buyer was able to take full possession and control of the property and take over the mortgage of the seller so that the interest rate was a lot lower. It allowed the property to cash flow and it gave some time to the buyer to uplift the value of the building and then obtain a mortgage to fully complete the agreement for sale and obtain title in his name once the building had been uplifted in value. Agreements for sale are a really great creative strategy because the investor who knows them is able to perceive deals where it may appear on the surface that it's not a good deal. The seller is able to sell the property at a higher sale price because it uplifts the value of the building or it gives more value to the property. Agreements for sale are a really great creative tool because it allows the buyer to perceive deals where there otherwise wouldn't. It allows the seller to sell the property at a higher value, at a higher purchase price because it has inherent value to the buyer. It also is a great tool to give time to the buyer to uplift and raise the value of the property during which they don't have to obtain financing for themselves. So an agreement for sale is a really great creative solution that is win-win for both seller and buyer. Here are 3 examples of ways I've seen agreements for sale used. A developer can use an agreement for sale to obtain site plan approval before getting the property in their name. An individual can buy a house before they have the credit to obtain their mortgage, or an investor can buy a multifamily property before they've uplifted the value to obtain a better mortgage. If you're still here, like, comment, subscribe, and investors, let us know in the comments what else you want to hear about. And remember, freedom is within reach if your foundation is strong. See you in the next one.